Let's get to our panel. Joining us from New York is Amy Holmes. She's a political commentator and columnist for the Swiss weekly Die Weltwoche. With us here in Washington is the president and chief correspondent of Feature Story News, Simon Marks. Michael Johns is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He's the co-founder of the U.S. National Tea Party movement. And Hilary Shelton is the director of the NAACP's Washington Bureau. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Hilary, let's start here in the studio. There we heard the president deny that he's a racist. He also said that he has a strong record of accomplishment on behalf of African Americans. Does he?
I would have to disagree. Certainly, if you look at a couple of these issues that he's raising, number one, as you talk about the unemployment rate, he's right at one hand, but on the other hand, it's not being totally honest or transparent. It is the lowest unemployment rate in the history since the data has been collected for about 80 years now, right around. But if you look at the African-American unemployment rate, you'll recognize that in any given day, it's always at least twice higher than it is for the white American community and other communities as well throughout the country. That's a big issue. When we talk about the issue of racism, at some point, we're going to have a very serious conversation about the definition of racism. Racism, racial prejudices plus power, and how power is utilized to destabilize, whether intentionally or with disregard, a particular group of people by virtue of the color of their skin. If you look at issues like the criminal justice system, I do give him credit for actually signing a bill that was much better than the initial First Step Act. I give him a lot of credit for that. However, if you look at our prisons, you'll see that in our prisons, about 40% are still African Americans, so African Americans are only 12.5% of the national population. There are a lot of challenges before us. What he said was a bit disingenuous, but with some iota of truth throughout that discussion.
Amy Holmes, President Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, he was asked about the president's comments. He was on a television program over the weekend. This was an interview he did with the Fox News network. Let's listen to the exchange between Mick Mulvaney and the anchor, Chris Wallace. Let's watch this.
What this is about, though, is the president fighting back against what he saw as being illegitimate attacks about the border in the hearing this week. If you go online, you can see the questioning that Elijah Cummings did of Kevin McAleenan regarding the conditions at the border. Mr. Cummings saying that children were sleeping or sitting in their own feces. That's not right. It's not accurate.
2 weeks ago, he goes after these 4 members of the squad, all women of color, and says they should go back to the crime-infested countries from which they come. Then he talks about Elijah Cummings, and he says his district is rat and rodent infested. Infested. It sounds like vermin. It sounds subhuman. And these are all 6 members of Congress who are people of color.
I think you're spending way too much time reading between the lines.
So, Amy, what do you make of this? What's your view of the president using that kind of language? And also, why is he going after the 4 women in Congress? I mean, he's also said disparaging things about Mexicans in the past.
Well, I wouldn't get too much into a linguistic analysis of President Trump, since we know that his vocabulary tends to be repetitive and limited, unfortunately. But we also know from President Trump, from his own book about how to be successful in business, that he believes in going after your tormentors and going after them personally. And as your reporter pointed out, that Elijah Cummings was being very tough with his Secretary of Homeland Security. Obviously, the squad, they've been very personal and very tough in their attacks on President Trump. If you remember, Rashida Tlaib, when she first got into office, she said, at a victory rally that we're going to impeach the bleep bleep, which she has since repeated. President Trump, he believes in punching back, being personal. And if you remember, even during the election in 2016, during the Republican primary, he went after Megyn Kelly and said she had blood coming out of wherever, whatever that was supposed to mean. Lying Ted, low energy Jeb, little Marco. This is exactly the type of bullying tactics that President Trump likes to use. And he also, I will say, is not terribly sensitive to whether or not it has racial implications. He's a tough fighter on the political field. And if that inflames racial tensions, I don't think that he's terribly concerned with that potential effect.
But, Amy, is he aware of the fact that people are calling this racist?
He is aware of that, and you know, he would point out, as his chief of staff did, that he did not introduce the topic of race in his tweets going after Elijah Cummings, who is the chairman of the Oversight Committee that's investigating texts and emails that could very well hit Ivanka and Jared Kushner. I think President Trump takes that very personally, and as I say, I don't think that he thinks so much about the racial implications, but I think for a lot of American voters, what they see is squabbling instead of solutions. If we really want to address poverty in Baltimore or in Detroit, where the Democratic debates are going to be held tonight, Detroit has a poverty rate of 38, almost 39%. So tweets, they don't solve that problem. We want to see deeds, not tweets, leadership, not sniping.
Simon, clearly this is exposing deep divisions in the country, but when we look at the attacks on Representative Cummings after Cummings himself criticized conditions on the border, we've heard these criticisms from other people as well. I mean, is this about Representative Cummings and the fact that he's African-American, or is there something more at play here?
Well, I think Amy is absolutely right in saying that Donald Trump is a proven fighter. He always fights back, but he's also a proven practitioner of diversionary tactics. He didn't need to go on this rant about Elijah Cummings. He's doing it partly because he's got deep personal animus to the congressman from Maryland because of the reasons that Rui outlined at the start of the program. The congressman from Maryland is digging in to those email communications that Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump were engaged in on private email accounts, and that has clearly infuriated the president. But also, we're not sitting here talking about Robert Mueller, we're not sitting here talking about Jeffrey Epstein, we're not sitting here talking about the growing number of Democrats on Capitol Hill who now favor impeachment proceedings being brought against the president of the United States. He is a grand master at saying to the American public and to the media, don't look over here, look over here. And that's what he's done over the last few days.
Michael Johns, the president has something of a history of going after people of color. We had the birther controversy with President Obama. Then, of course, we've just been talking about the people he went after in Congress as well. He's also been reluctant to criticize white supremacists. I mean, can you understand why some people label him a racist?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think it's become a convenient deflection, way overutilized in this country, as vast majority of Americans have realized, to sort of inoculate against legitimate policy and political criticism. Yes, in the sense that sometimes his verbiage is unpolished and could be better, but you know, I'm just reading, this is the Baltimore Sun, December 8th, 2015. Bernie Sanders, presidential candidate, Democrat, very progressive, maybe as progressive as it gets, went through the Sandtown section of West Baltimore, described it this way. He said, you would think that you were in a third world country. There was no outrage over that, no backlash, no allegations of racism. So in many respects, these allegations have become convenient euphemisms for political disagreements. And I think it's unfortunate because some of these are really legitimate issues there could even be some bipartisan agreement on if there was an opportunity afforded. But when we're talking about these, when we're getting into issues of allegations of racism, as opposed to talking about what's created poverty in Baltimore, why is $1.1 billion over the last 5 years not led to progress there? We're not talking about the questions that really matter.
Hilary,
and if I could jump in terms of President Trump's tactics, what's really strange about it is, you know, when he tweeted about this squad, the news was actually in his favor. He was getting a lot of positive press, and then he goes and does a tweet that kind of steps on that Democratic infighting that was going on, where the squad was calling Nancy Pelosi racist.
Right.
He didn't let that play out. Also, he was getting really pretty good press with the Bob Mueller testimony, that it was going in his favor. Both sides thought that testimony fell flat. Again, instead of letting it play out, he picked a different fight. So oftentimes, President Trump actually steps on what should be winning moments for his team.
Hilary, my question is, does Michael Johns have a point there? Is that criticism of Bernie Sanders valid?
Well, no, I think that the examples he's using are very helpful to use to compare and contrast. Yeah. Bernie Sanders talked about the challenges going on in Baltimore and talked about fixes that needed to be done. Right. He talked about investment, he talked about laws that needed to be changed, issues along those lines. When Donald Trump talked about the challenges going in Baltimore, it was utilized as a tool to actually deflect the congressman from Baltimore that also happens to be the chair of the Oversight Committee in the House of Representatives that's been so critical. Again, is how this power is being utilized to address its challenges before us in Baltimore and other places as well.
But also, there is an opportunity afforded by all of this, as Michael suggests, but it's not an opportunity that the President of the United States is taking. If he's so concerned passionately about the plight of people in areas of Baltimore, why isn't he bringing everybody to the White House? Why isn't he going there? Why isn't he convening conversations aimed at trying to improve the situation that he suggests has led to billions of dollars being stolen? Instead, he's rabble-rousing.
Well, he is, and not offering any way of solution, anything else along those lines. I firmly agree with that. At some point, he's going to have to take on those real issues. But again, this is just used as a deflection.
Okay, Hilary, we just had a poll out from Quinnipiac on this particular question. The people who were polled were asked, do you think President Trump is a racist? Broadly speaking, 51% of those voters who were asked said yes, he is racist. 45% said no. But if we look at the breakdown, it shows deep race and ideological divisions. 80% of African Americans say the president is racist. More whites, 50%, say he is not racist, against 46% who say he is. And as far as the political parties are concerned, overwhelming number of Democrats say is racist. Overwhelming number of Republicans say no.
Well, it's how you measure it in many, many ways. If you're talking about his actions are quite racist in how he's utilizing power. Without the power dynamic, it's simple prejudice or other forms of discrimination. But in this case, he's using not only the power of the bully pulpit, but the power of the presidency himself to leverage this in a direction that is not supportive and to actually discriminates against one because of their racial realities. We know there's no one in this country, aside of the Native Americans, that actually didn't try to run away from some challenges going on in some other place in the world, whether someplace throughout Europe, South America, Central America, whatever the case might very well be. Why is it that this president seems to point to only those coming from predominantly countries of color to say the kind of things he's saying?
Amy, what do you make of these figures? 80% of African Americans say he is a racist.
You know, that doesn't surprise me, and I think that's actually been fairly consistent, that it breaks down along race and also breaks down along party identification. But what we know about President Trump is that he's also an opportunist, and he takes the opportunity to go after his critics, to go after people who he sees as a threat. And we also know that President Trump, he likes people who like him. So when Kanye West, for example, came to the Oval Office wearing the MAGA hat, saying that it made him feel like Superman, Trump ate it up. He loved it. When he was in France and Emmanuel Macron, he put on the huge, Bastille Day parade. President Trump loved that too. Just last week, President Trump was pressuring the Swedish government to let the rapper A$AP Rocky out of prison. I think Donald Trump is attracted to celebrity, and he probably also thought it might, win him some points with the black community. I don't think that that would happen. But as I say, I think we need to see President Trump maybe take a step back and look a little bit more at who he attacks, who he doesn't, and oftentimes he attacks those who attack him.
And I would only add the circumstances and be added to that as well.
So should we be surprised at what is going on right now? I mean, we hear this outrage in the media all the time, but if you actually look at Donald Trump, and Roy Rutenberg in his report at the beginning of the show told us something about that. I mean, even before he became president, he was investigated under the Fair Housing Act because he wouldn't rent property to black people. And then, of course, there's the rub that a lot of the properties that he criticized belonged to his son-in-law's family.
Look, I mean, there's a long history there. It runs from New York all the way to Washington, D.C., and makes several stops along the way during the course of Donald Trump's career. We also shouldn't be surprised about this because if you look back at the midterm elections, Donald Trump used the cry against illegal immigration from the southern border as a rallying cry to try and deliver votes. And I think that this is the beginning of, even though today he argued there's no strategy here. He was asked if this was a strategy. He said, no, I'm not being strategic. He definitely is being strategic in that he sees this as a wedge issue that is going to deliver voters to his attempt to gain re-election in November 2020, even if those polling numbers suggest that he's playing with fire there, particularly with women voters in the United States who appear to be recoiling from some of the language that he's using. He's hoping that it's going to energize his male white base in sufficient numbers that they're going to get out and put him over the top again in November of next year.
Michael, is that the case? You know, as much as many people may find his comments reprehensible, may disagree with them, is there a strategy here that he's feeling that with this language, with the words that he uses, he can rally his base?
I'm fairly close to this administration. I would say that this is a president who cares greatly and deeply about the plight of African Americans in this country. I mean, you cited allegations in fair housing. He also was given numbers of awards from African American organizations during his time as a real estate developer in New York. He's maintained very close and long-standing relationships with African American organizations and individuals. And is it just possible that for once, maybe, realizing that I guess everybody in this has some political viewpoint regarding the president, that maybe we give him the benefit of the doubt that he thinks Baltimore could do better than what they're doing right now by every conceivable metric that you would use to assess how things are going, particularly in Elijah Cummings' West Baltimore district. It's a unequivocal disaster. Why not now at least acknowledge those facts, that the status quo is unacceptable, that the liberal programs and Democratic mayors that have governed over that city have failed, and that it's time to start looking at some different approaches. And that includes both parties. And as far as meeting at the White House, I mean, the president's met repeatedly with African American organizations. His door is wide open, and he said it again, to Baltimore if they're seeking federal involvement. That's not predominantly or most immediately, because of jurisdictional issues, a federal issue. It's more commonly a state, local. And just quote one final point.
Yeah.
I'd be very careful about these polls. You're citing the same polls that said Hillary Clinton would be in her second or third year right now. Yeah. You can't have a media that lambasts the president every day, then have them call somebody on the phone and ask what they think of him.
Okay,
they're not always going to get the right answer.
All right. Simon.
Be careful about the polls, but also be very careful about the president's claims. Today, on the White House lawn, he suggested that the White House switchboards have been melting down with African Americans calling the White House to tell him that he said exactly the right thing, not just about Baltimore, but more broadly about inner city policy. I mean, Michael, do you honestly believe there are provable, voluminous numbers of calls from African Americans to the White House to make that point? It seems an utterly spurious and incredible claim.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yes, I do believe the president. I know for a fact that African Americans are not looking for Democrat or liberal or Republican or conservative solutions. They're looking for solutions. And you know what? For all Barack Obama said he was going to do for all these cities, he left them worse than he found them to begin with. And now you got a president acknowledging pretty bluntly, maybe a little roughly, that the situation in Baltimore has been vastly poorly managed on every level, and that things should be done better. All right. I think you give the guy the benefit of the doubt and say, let's work together and make that happen.
Okay, Hilary.
And one thing actually that I would add to Michael's comments, one thing I would add to Michael's comments is the BBC did an in-depth profile of Baltimore in February of 2017 and interviewed residents in Baltimore who said they want President Trump to come there and help them.
Right.
So to Michael's point, we need to be looking at solutions, not all of this partisan sniping and trying to do a linguistics analysis of President Trump's statements.
Okay. Hilary, I just want to get to an earlier point that Michael made, and that we probably have got this all wrong, that President Trump actually has received awards for his efforts at providing housing for African Americans in New York. He's received awards from African American organizations.
Well, let me just say that I work for the NAACP, the nation's oldest and largest grassroots-based civil rights organization. And perhaps for one event or another, he may have gotten just that. As we look at what's going on right now, we cannot lose the context of things like Charlottesville and how it plays into this conversation, this discussion. So we talk about issues like dog whistles that are too often utilized, that are aimed at right-wing extremist organizations that are quite racist in their activities and everything they say they are to do. So if we're thinking about Mr. Trump under these circumstances, the question is, why are you not using your power in a way that you can actually address the real problems and issues going on in Baltimore and so many other cities across the country? Why are you not using your power? As to looking at the issues of African Americans disproportionately having no health care insurance, wanting to rip back health care insurance as we know it now, making matters even worse. Why is it that you're not using your power? As to think about access to higher education, jobs, business ownership, and other things that are important to every community, including ours. He has the opportunity to do it. He's being critical of one city, but you begin to wonder the reason why when you see what's going on in that city and he's not offering any solutions.
Amy, is this going to get worse? Are we going to see more and more of this in the months ahead?
Well, I mean, we're going to see President Trump in the months ahead, and we know what that means in terms of the way that he communicates with the public and the way that he attacks his enemy. But one last thing I would add to this conversation is that, interestingly enough, everyone is forgetting that so far the only candidate who has deliberately injected race into an attack on an opponent for political gain is actually Kamala Harris. If you remember during the Democratic debate when she went after former Vice President Joe Biden over busing and suggesting that he was standing in the way of desegregating America's public schools. So far, that's actually been the most explicit use of race for electoral or at least election gain.
There was an article in the Atlantic magazine, Simon, which said that if this is an election tactic that the president is using, it could backfire on him.
Look, I mean, I think he's playing with fire. I think there's no question about that. I suspect he thinks he's wearing thermal gloves, but he's definitely playing with fire. And, you know, looking ahead to November of 2020, it feels like we are at the beginning of a very, very long road. Every night I go to bed, he's still tweeting. Every morning I wake up, he's already started tweeting. Twitter is not the place where government gets done, and it provides him with opportunity, but it also provides him with danger.
And Michael, what can we expect from Donald Trump over in the months ahead?
Well, it's important to remember, I mean, President Trump actually did considerably better than Mitt Romney or John McCain in attracting African-American votes in 2016. Some of these polls that have come out, which I just said should be discarded, which I guess is a little bit of hypocrisy on my end, do show him with some considerable amount of support that's been gained since then. He's lowered the unemployment rate, the lowest in the history of African-American employment measurements. He's done criminal justice reform. I think he's very focused on some of these urban issues. And that is important because it makes the Republican Party a national party again, not just a party that is of geographic relevance. And that's one of the great things that I think many of us see in this president, the idea that we can be competitive in every district, in every city, in every town, in every locale around the country with our message and with our candidates.
You agree with that, Hilary?
Not totally and not at all in many, many ways. I think if we want to see what's going on again, let's look at the real data. When we look at the data, we know that there's many fixes that need to be done. We can go all across one thing about quality of life indicators for all Americans, and sadly and unfortunately, I do not see this president trying to push us in that direction.
And we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us.